Madison Madden. Welcome to Food Experience Unplugged.
Thank you, Michelle. It's wonderful to be here.
Oh, so happy to have you here as an Ayurvedic doctor and author and amazing mind, body, spirit connector. So welcome. This podcast is available on multiple platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. Please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to be informed as new episodes become available. If you enjoyed today's episode or any of our episodes, please rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. As always, check out our website at foodexperienceunplugged.com for some resources as you begin your health journey.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with you about all of those things today.
Fantastic. Well, to get started, will you take a moment to introduce yourself and what brought you to this point in your life and career? Why the direction that you've gone with the mind, body, spirit connection?
Sure. For me, my journey began with my own health. I was very sick as a young person. The story goes is that I had been playing in a field at a park that had been recently sprayed with pesticides. And I got very sick afterwards, and nobody really knew how to treat it or what to do. So I was treated with antibiotics and steroids in various different ways, and having a lowered immune system because of that. And, all the complex things we now know about the gut and the immune system and the mind and how they all connect. I was basically got worse as time went on. I had a lot of seemingly unrelated health issues. My immune system was pretty beat. My nervous system was challenged. I had lots of different expressions of disease that the doctors did not know how to treat it. So I was on antibiotics a lot through my life. I had all sorts of different conditions. And I basically got to a point when I was about 19 years old where I felt like I was dying. And I was on about 9 different pharmaceutical medications, and each one seemed to lead to another one, which had side effects that then led to another medication. And I was in college. I felt like a 90-year-old walking around in my dorm room. And I decided one day that I needed to take my health into my own hands, because I didn't think I would live to be 30. I didn't think I would have children. So one day I looked down at the medications I was taking and said, okay, it's time for me to start changing my life. So the first thing that I did is I started to change my diet. Somebody at that point had recommended that I take gluten out of my diet. And so that was one of the first things that I did. I learned at that time that I was sensitive, and within about a month, a good percentage of the chronic pain that I was in had subsided and my digestive issues had gotten better. To give you some perspective, I had chronic digestive issues. I was in chronic pain in various different joints in my body. I had neurological issues down my arms and hands. I was working with the disability service at my college. I had high cholesterol by the time I was in second grade. I had asthma. I had kidney issues. I had heartburn. I had all of these, seemingly unrelated issues. And I realized that food was a huge player in my life. And so I started on this investigative journey into food, essentially, where at that time, gluten intolerance wasn't what it was today, where, it's easy to find foods that are gluten-free. And to be clear, I actually am fine with gluten these days. I can digest it fine. I eat it, and it's all good. But at that point, I was very sensitive to it. So I started going to the grocery store and learning about food. I started reading labels. I started to realize that at that time, gluten was in everything, that it was in cranberry juice. It was in fillers. It was in gravy. It was in box food. It was almost everything I picked up had some sort of gluten in it. And that piqued my curiosity. Why? Why is this food in everything? And so then I started learning and reading and investigating, and I started to learn about industrial agriculture processes and, food and packaging and all of these things related to what goes in our body. And I was astounded, and I was mortified, and I was inspired simultaneously, because it was just this whole world that nobody was talking about. And so it led me on about a 15-year journey into kind of the roots and relationship with food and our health. And I learned about gardening and agriculture and where our food comes from. And I got led to Ayurveda, which is this incredible science of life that is over 5,000 years old, the oldest system of health that is still practiced continually today, that has roots in Eastern India, that teaches us these very refined practices of how to use food in a way that nourishes us and as medicine. And that whole journey, essentially, through that whole journey, I was able to reverse all of my chronic health issues,
Wow.
which were told to me that were irreversible, that were permanent, that I would be on medications for the rest of my life, that I was going to need all of these surgeries, that, all of these things. And through food and yoga and Ayurveda and changing my relationship to myself and my body and to what I consume and using these natural methods, I live a healthy, pain-free life these days, and I'm able to digest food. And so that is what led me to where I am. And that journey was deeply educating and inspiring for me. And I realized at the time when I began it, I thought I was very alone. I thought that I was kind of isolated in my suffering. I didn't mention this already, I was suffering from a long-term eating disorder. I was bulimic and had been for many years. And which is very common with people with eating disorders, that, you feel alone. You feel like you're the only one on the planet that's going through this, this destructive relationship with food. And come to realize years later that almost every single person that I know or have encountered in my life has some sort of disordered relationship with food, men and women. And that, in my book, I talk about how I actually believe we have a culture-wide eating disorder. And our relationship with food is very influenced by our societies and cultures' expression and projection of what food means to us and to our bodies. So I studied Ayurveda. I became a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine. I'm a Ayurvedic doctor, member of the National Ayurvedic Medical Association. And I recently published the book called Mind, Body, Food that explores this relationship with food in a very in-depth way, that doesn't look at food through the lens of a diet. We have tons of dietary theories out there. We have all sorts of dietary theories that tell us what and how and when we should eat and why and all that. And to be honest, I found myself a little bit turned off by a lot of what we have in the realm of diet and nutrition, because I came to realize in my practice, through my own experience with my clients, that telling people that they need to change their diet doesn't always work. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. People have very deeply ingrained habits and patterns around what they eat and why they do it. And just telling them that they need to change their habits usually works for a little while, and then they go right back to their old habits. And so I started to ask why. What is that? And I realized that food is not just calories and micronutrients, but it's directly tied to our feelings of comfort and sustenance and survival. It's tied to our experiences of longing for pleasure and rebellion and artistry and eroticism. And it's tied to our sense of community and connection, or on the other hand, loneliness and isolation. It's tied to our stress response. And honestly, it's tied to our spiritual reality of the circle of life, the sacred offering of what keeps us alive that we all share. Our cravings linked to our ancestral roots, to the microbiota in our gut, which greatly outnumbers the number of humans on Earth. Our choices around food are just not as simple as we like to think they are. And in order to change our habits around them, we have to change our relationship to food. And to do that, we must face ourselves, our traumas, our desires, and our own empowerment with a sense of radical honesty and self-compassion. And so that's what led me to where I am and why I'm here talking to you. And that was a big introduction. Happy to talk about any and all of those things in more depth.
Let's kind of dissect it a little bit. You had this battle. You said enough is enough. You went in a different direction. why did you feel driven to go into that career wise versus, okay, now I'm healed, now I'm going to be, whatever some other profession? Why this direction similar to the battles that you faced?
I to be totally honest, I felt somewhat of a duty, um, because I looked around and realized that, like I said, that I wasn't alone in this journey, that a tremendous amount of people are struggling with their own version of their health and their relationship with food, and why that all ties into their whole journey of life. And so I was inspired by the journey I had been on, and it felt like, okay, now it's my time to give back what I've learned, like I couldn't, I almost couldn't not, like, it wasn't ever a question for me. It was just like, great, okay, now I've learned, and let's pass it on, pay it forward.
Mm, fantastic. Now, how long, from the time you decided, okay, enough is enough, I'm taking my health in my own hands, until you felt like, at a point where, okay, I'm well now. What was that time frame generally? Did it take a
Good
while?
question. It
Did
was
it
years. It was
was
years, and that's something that I think people struggle with their health. You know, I would say it took me about 5 to 7 years of intense restructuring of my life, of daily yoga practice, of changing my food, working with herbs, refocusing my entire mindset and life in a direction that was authentic to me, as opposed to full of guilt, shame, obligation. And we like to think of those all of those things as disconnected or isolated, compartmentalized from each other, but I've realized that all of those are very connected. So, after 5 to 7 years, it was like, great, I feel really good. I remember the very first time that I ate wheat on purpose. And it was a big moment, one of the things I missed the most. This is going to make me sound really dorky, probably, but one of the things I missed the most was flour tortillas.
Mm,
And
okay.
people might miss donuts or cookies, but I missed flour tortillas. And I remember my partner and I went out to Chipotle, and it was this big moment. I got to eat, instead of a bowl, I got to eat a burrito. And it was like, I'm going to do it. This is so exciting. And I didn't get a stomach ache. And so I guess my point here is that it was a long, arduous, but inspiring process that took many years to get to that point. But I learned through that there's no magic pill. And we're constantly looking for a magic pill to help us with our ailments, right? Even if it's, even those of us in the holistic world, we often are looking for the superfood, or the special herbal remedy that's going to take away my XYZ.
Mhm.
And I've learned through my process that the magic pill doesn't really exist, that we have to do our inner work in order to really transform these patterns that are leading us to, that our suffering and our pain and our experience of our health are really messengers for us to change. And in order to really do that, we have to bring all of these pieces together.
Mhm.
And that's a hard thing to do. It takes time, it takes discipline, it takes courage to go inside. But that's an important piece. And if you go into that excited for that journey, that's an amazing experience.
Absolutely. Wow, I love it. Now, for those unfamiliar with Ayurveda, could you kind of explain that and how that is connected with what you're doing with regard to your relationship with food?
Yeah, so Ayurveda is Ayurveda, Ayurveda, is a traditional system of health that stems from ancient India. And it's been around for 5, 10, 15,000 years. It's a holistic modality that, in many parts of the world, is considered a full system of health, practiced in a very similar way that we practice Western medicine or allopathic medicine here in the States. Um, and it looks at the body as an interconnected whole. So it looks at the environment and the body also as an interconnected whole, and that we work with food, we work with lifestyle, we work with mind body connection, we work with herbal remedies, um, spirituality, and anything that's necessary essentially to bring the body back into a balanced state, into a homeostasis, as opposed to a spiral of imbalance. And so Ayurveda is essentially looking for the root cause of dis-ease in the body. As opposed to just treating symptoms, we're looking for what's causing the dis-ease in the first place, and let's remedy that.
Mhm.
And I was fortunate enough to come across Ayurveda through my experience in yoga. I studied very intensely with a yogi for about 10 years, um, living, breathing intensively with a yogi, and he was able to introduce me to Ayurveda. And Ayurveda is it's a very sophisticated form of medicine
Mhm.
that was able to help me past what I couldn't do on my own. That just, taking gluten out of my diet or, doing yoga every day wasn't necessarily, it got me to a certain point. But then the sophisticated nature of Ayurveda and understanding disease, or the disease process, or what we call samprapti in Ayurveda, and using herbs and remedies and daily routines and various things to refine how I could come back to a point of balance, was astounding. And so it was very inspiring for me to learn about Ayurveda and dedicate a good amount of my life to helping bring Ayurveda to more of the forefront of people's awareness.
Mhm. Okay. Now, how do you feel? You mentioned, it's more of a kind of a holistic modality with regard to your eating disorders as well as other ailments. How does that contribute? How does that whole mind body spirit connection contribute to alleviating things like eating disorders or other ailments that you suffered and perhaps your clients do as well?
Good question. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that I think that we need to look at our relationship with food versus just the calories and the micronutrients that we're taking in. And what that means to me is that we have a relationship with food that we've been having since the moment we were conceived and will be to the day we die. I consider it our longest term relationship. And it takes on many of the same dynamics that intimate relationships do. So we like to play control games with food. We have aversions. We fantasize about food. It takes on a lot of these same dynamics. We have codependent dynamics. We have poor communication. We sometimes have we binge because we're so excited, similar to how some people do with various dynamics and relationships and sexuality and things like that, right? Um, and so I realized at one point that my eating disorder, bulimia, which for some people may seem really extreme if you haven't experienced it, I've come to realize that it's just a dot on the spectrum of many diverse expressions of eating disorders. For me, bulimia was an expression of control, which so many eating disorders are, where I had parts of my early life that were saying, you know, consume as much as you want, be take it in, enjoy. And then other parts of my life that I grew up in a poor family, with limited resources and limited food sometimes. And so food was a scarce resource. And so I grew up with this feeling of scarcity. And so I ping ponged back and forth from this feeling of needing to take as much as I can and needing to control what I do. I was a dancer. So I had early training in body image, which so many women do, and not just women, people in general. Um, and we learn from magazines, from TV, from our mothers, from all sorts of directions that we constantly need to be thinking about what we look like and what our weight is and how food contributes to that, right? So I bounced back and forth, and it was very intense and dynamic, and it was secret because it felt gross and dirty. And it wasn't until I started to be open and talk about it that I realized that so many people were having their own version of this that I knew. um, so that is all to say that our relationship with food, even as I grew to know nutrition better, I knew I shouldn't be binging, right? But my relationship with food was tied to things that were much more than just the nutrients in the food. They were tied to my experience of my parents. They were tied to my experience of safety. They were tied to my experience of financial security. They were tied to my experience of my own feeling of empowerment and my sense of self and my confidence. And so that was what was actually driving my behavior, even though my knowledge said something else.
Mm.
And so that's why I say, let's look at all that stuff first. Because until we look at all that stuff and that soil gets, tilled, then our knowledge only goes so far.
Okay. So once you had that additional knowledge, you were able to alleviate your own bulimia and be able to kind of is it more of an understanding of that root cause that you're talking about, where these feelings come from, or are you kind of being able to alleviate those feelings or eliminate them?
Well,
Perhaps.
I'll tell you a story. So the very last time I ever had an episode of bulimia, and I'm speaking very openly about this on purpose because it's something that is often closeted and not spoken about very openly. So I'm doing that intentionally. So I apologize to anybody who's listening that it might feel intimate to, and challenging to listen to. But so I would have these episodes, these binging episodes, and they were very much a stress response. It was a feeling of scarcity, it was a feeling of insecurity, it was a feeling of stress, and I would binge and I'd go and, and it was horrendously painful because I felt so gross and isolated and things like that. And I remember the very last time I ever did this, I did it and witnessed and watched myself. It was almost like I wanted to see what was driving this behavior. And so I kind of watched as I did it. And then I shared it. I shared it with two people. One was my partner and one was my teacher, my yoga teacher. And I called him up and I had never shared it with him before. And I said, I need help. And I shared with him what was going on. And I'll never forget his response, his voice. He was an older, in his 60s, he was serious but jubilant and very loving man. And he goes, Madison, food is good. And right then and there, it penetrated me. It sat with me. The phrase "food is good." It hit me like right in the heart. And I took a deep breath and I sat with that for a second. And then I said, "Oh yeah, you're right. Food is good." And I realized in that moment that I had all of these preconceived notions of all the ways that food was either scarce, was limited, was going to make me fat, was expensive, was blah, 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 all these negative connotations of what food is. And in that moment, realizing that food is good completely changed my trajectory. And that was the last time I ever had a bulimic episode.
Wow.
Which was huge because we're talking about a decade of this behavior. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So that one, hey, I'm going to share this, you share it with the yoga teacher, that his words just had that powerful influence on you, you think that, hey, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to stop this, the bulimic episodes. You think
It
that's what the driver was?
it wasn't just his words, it was that food in that moment transitioned from being something that was adversarial to being something that was a self-care practice.
Mm.
And so then started to notice that my inner voice then started to transition from, oh, I shouldn't have that. Oh, that's bad. Oh, I want that, but I shouldn't, or, various different things like that, to, is that going to be nourishing to me? What would feel nourishing to me? I'm hungry right now. What would feel nourishing to me? To, oh, you know what? I'm not going to eat that because I'm actually full. So it started to become something that I was using to care for myself as opposed to something that I was using to punish myself.
Mm.
In Ayurveda, we have a definition of diet. And the word is ahara, Ahara. And ahara means everything that you intake, which means your food, your water, or your liquid, your air, and your perceptions. So it's not just vitamin B and carbohydrates and vitamin D and fat and the various other combinations of what we like to talk about, but it's the food that I take in, it's the liquid that I consume, it's the pollutants in the air that I breathe that my body has to um, you know digest. And it's also the perceptions. It's what I digest on my Instagram feed. It's the environment that my home is in. It's the way that I digest all of the images and all of the sounds and all of the things that I consume on a daily basis. All of that is food, and all of that is considered our diet. And the most important thing in Ayurveda about your diet is if you digest it. Not necessarily what you eat, but what you digest and how well you digest it. Because if you don't digest it, you could eat the most nutrient dense thing on the planet. But if you don't digest it, it's going to sit there and it's going to cause inflammation. It's going to cause indigestion. I can eat something that's very easy to digest. It goes through me. It creates energy. It gets transformed into tissue. It eliminates well. It assimilates well. And what we don't realize is that, or we don't think about very often, is that literally our body is made of the food we eat. So my cheek has been made from the food that I eat. My teeth, my eyes, my fingernails, my hair, everything in my body has literally been transformed from what I put in my mouth and what I eat and what I breathe and what I consume through liquid. And so when we realize that connection, it then becomes something very different. It's not just, I'm hungry, so let me go grab a cheeseburger right now. It's, oh, I care about myself so much that I'm going to put in my body something that matches that. And then the knowledge follows that. The knowledge follows the intention rather than the intention trying to follow the knowledge. And that creates a very different path, in my opinion.
It does. It's a more holistic, a more powerful path than you would otherwise just going on diet X or
Right.
some other thing.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now, to kind of operationalize it a little bit, really, when the rubber meets the road, how do you go about your life essentially, like a day-to-day relationship with food that you yourself have gone through, as well as perhaps examples of what your clients have gone through?
Sure. Well, our daily habits create our health. And so I realize that when I'm not caring for myself to the best of my ability, my food habits suffer. So if I'm overloaded, overcommitted, stressed out, don't feel authentic in the way that I'm navigating my life, my food habits start to fall short. And then I start to feel the consequences of that. Whereas when I prioritize what is balanced for me in my life, and I intentionally set up a daily routine that is that I know is balanced for me, then my life kind of follows a more obviously balanced trajectory. So I am my constitution in Ayurveda is what we call Pitta and Vata. So Pitta is my main constitution, Vata is my secondary constitution. I can tend to go out of balance in both of those directions. So I have to be aware of eating things that are too hot, too acidic, too spicy, and too inflammatory in quality. So my diet consists of a lot of vegetables. My diet consists of a lot of warm cooked food because the vata in my constitution, which people may or may not know what I'm talking about, and we can go into more detail there, makes things that are cold and dry challenging for me. So I eat a lot of warm cooked foods. I love having soup for dinner. Soup is my favorite dinner. It's very easy to digest. It's warm. It's light. I personally am a vegetarian. I have been since I was about 22 years old. And that was actually a big part of my transition to what I consider a healthier lifestyle for me. I don't try to convert people to vegetarianism. I don't think that that is useful, but I do recommend for most people to eat a largely plant-based diet. Um, because one of the things that we don't often talk about is what's missing from someone's diet when we eat a largely animal based diet or carbohydrate based diet. We don't realize that we're missing all of this rich, beautiful, nutrient dense fruits and vegetables and a diversity of fats and grains and all of these beautiful things. And so I try to diversify my diet with all of those things. So I usually have it, it varies per the season. So in the wintertime, I, for breakfast, often have more warm, heavy breakfasts. In the summertime, I often have more cooling breakfasts. For lunchtime, it's important for me to have regular meal times. So I have lunch as my heaviest meal of the day, where in Ayurveda, we consider that the time of the day where our metabolism is highest, where we can digest the most. The sun is at the peak, our activity is at the peak. So our digestive fire, what we call our Agni, is also at its peak. So I make lunch my main meal, and then I have an early dinner, which is usually lighter. And then I have a fast between an early dinner and breakfast in the morning. I also will do some sort of movement practice in the morning before I eat. Gets my circulation going, gets my Agni going, gets a mild sweat before eating. And I one of the things we don't often talk about is stopping when you're hungry, but not hungry anymore, eating when we're hungry and stopping when we're not. I've realized that that is a harder thing to do than it seems from money, because our relationship with food is often riddled with shoulds and should nots rather than a somatic relationship with how our body feels. So in Ayurveda teaches us that we should eat until we are about 3/4 full. So we're full of about one half food and about 1/4 liquid, and we leave about 1/4 space. And the analogy I like to use is like a laundry machine. So when we put stuff in the laundry machine, we can't fill it too much. Otherwise, it can't churn and clean and do its thing. The laundry machine gets stuck. So we put enough of the clothes in there, and then we add the, digestive enzymes, the soap, and we add the water to it, and then we leave enough space for it to churn. And our stomach is very similar to that. It has to churn the food so that it begins its digestive process. And so I often, with my clients, work on, what does that mean? How do I even know? What does it even feel like to be 3/4 of the way full, right? There's not a set amount of calories that I can count, because, we like to teach especially young girls how to calorie count, which then often turns into a completely disordered relationship with food that, fuels this effort to control something that, their world feels largely out of control. So I usually don't recommend that, even for people that are looking to lose weight. So a lot of what I like to do is help people reintegrate a somatic relationship with their own body. What does it actually feel like to feel hunger? What is your body? What cues was your body giving you? What does it feel like to feel full? What's that movement from empty to full? What does it feel like to feel overfull? And what happens then? How does your body feel like for the hours and days after that? What is a craving that's nourishing, and what's in a craving that's based in addiction? Those are two very different things, right? When we're in a stress response, we usually crave things that are not good for us. And when we're in a relaxed, they call it rest and digest response, we typically crave things that are nourishing for us. And so those are all these beautiful subtleties that we can actually learn to do on our own, where we don't have to necessarily follow some sort of caloric intake, or, when we learn about the beautiful diversity of nutrients in food, and we eat, lots of plants and a diversity of grains and all these things, we're getting everything that we need, and we can focus on how it influences and impacts us.
Mm, okay. Now, do you feel, since you had those health issues early on, do you did you come to understand, what it means to be hungry, what it means to be full, all of that based on those prior experiences? Or did you kind of wipe the slate clean and say, okay, what does it feel like to be hungry, to be full, etc.?
Isn't it funny that that's like it seems like such an elementary thing to be talking about, right? To be hungry and to be full. It's like we feed our infants when they're hungry and full, but it's such a real experience that we have. Um, I would say over the course of my healing journey, I began to refine that experience. I began to self reflect and notice, observe the experiences that I was having so that I could understand those sensations in my body. And we often, at this day and age, we spend so much time on the computers and so much time in our heads that we often completely neglect the sensations of our body and what they're telling us and the intelligence that they have. And so, in almost any condition, that's one of the most important things, in my opinion, to do is to reintegrate our relationship, our somatic, sensational relationship with our body.
Mm, I love that. Is just really, really honing in on what makes you you, essentially.
Right.
Oh, now for those first, just starting out, maybe they've got health issues, maybe not, but just rebuilding or establishing that relationship with food. What are some steps that people can take?
It's a good question. The first thing I would do is I would reframe your exploration from a self compassionate place. So we tend to have this critical voice in our heads that often comes from our early caregivers or some sense of authority in our life or something like that, that's constantly criticizing us for who we are and what we do and what choices we're making and blah, 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 all that sense, right? And who we should be and blah, blah, blah. And that early voice came from somewhere, but now has been adopted into ourselves and
Hmm.
is now our inner voice, right? And so we have to take responsibility for that. But we can do that from a place of radical self compassion. Okay, it's okay that I'm doing what I'm doing. I understand how I got here. I'm not bad or wrong for doing what I'm doing, for having the habits that I have. There's a reason for them. There's a contextual reason for them. That may sound simple and easy. In my opinion, is the most important and influential change that one could possibly make. Because now, coming from that place, now you have the empowerment to make different choices. You are now taking responsibility for the choices that you've made and where you've come, but not from a place of self criticism. And now you get to say, okay, I understand why and where I am right now. Where would I like to go? What would I like to invite into my life? What new habits would I like to invite? Would I like to change my relationship with food to be one that's not used the word adversarial earlier, right? Would I like
Mhm.
to change it to be one that feels like an ally as opposed to an adversary? Okay, great. Let's do that. And let's do that from a totally honest, totally self compassionate place. So, what does that mean? What do I need to do to make it feel that way? And what does that mean to me? As opposed to what does that mean to, the nutritionist that I read on, People magazine? And what does that mean to my mother or my father or to my partner or to all of these other voices in my life? What would it mean for me to have a healthy relationship with food? And what resources do I need to build around me to help hold me accountable to that, to help give me the knowledge, to help give me the habits and hold me to them? And I create a care team. It's kind of like a woman that has a baby and she has a doula and a midwife and a doctor and a sister and all of them are her care team, right? I want to change my relationship to food. I need a care team who's going to help me do that in a really supportive way. One of the things that I realized in my journey was that it was really hard to talk about food honestly because so many people had some sort of disordered eating that it was easy to reinforce each other's bad habits. Oh, you look great. You lost 10 pounds because you've been starving yourself. You look so good. Oh my gosh, you've been so stressed out for 6 months and that's made you lose 15 pounds. You look great. Don't worry about it. How often have we heard that? And
Mm.
so it's so easy to reinforce those. So when you're looking to change your relationship with food, it's important to surround yourself with people and resources that are feeding you from the place of allyship.
Mm.
You know, I remember a client of mine who she she came to me and she was underweight and she had lost her period and she was stressed and felt disconnected and she was a little scared because she wanted to get pregnant someday. And but she also grew up as a dancer and had very strict body image, standards for herself.
Sure.
And her friends would always tell her, how beautiful she was, and when she lost weight, how beautiful she was, and all these things that everybody was jealous of her, and all this stuff. And we had a very frank conversation about, our bodies aren't supposed, as women, our bodies aren't supposed to look like they did when we were 12, and, a little bit of fat on our lower abdomen is actually healthy, especially as we're growing a baby. And, all these different things like what's the difference between feeling like a woman and feeding ourselves versus starving ourselves as a girl, and where do those come from? And this conversation really impacted her, and she actually gained weight for the first time in her life, and she got her period back, and she conceived a beautiful baby girl. And so it's, there's unexpected gems in this exploration, which sometimes feels scary to do. But when we do it, it's full of beautiful things that only impact our lives in the positive. So I guess that was all coming from the position of sometimes this topic is hard to talk about because it often mirrors. I had no idea how charged of a topic food was until I wrote my book and started talking about it and realized that whew, this is charged. This triggers people, it's hard sometimes, but it's also an incredibly beautiful thing, and something we can't get away from. We have a relationship with food until we die, so we can't break up with it like we can other relationships and get it out of our life. So we might as well do the work to make it something that is nourishing for us.
Amazing. Oh, Madison. Well, how can people get in contact with you?
You can find me at livewiseheal.com. And you can find me on Instagram it is at livewise_Madison Madden.
Fantastic. We will include all of those in the show notes. Madison, it's been amazing. You are fantastic. I love your holistic approach to it, to really individualize what makes that person and then rebuilding, essentially, refocusing on the relationship with food. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey everyone, Michelle Seidling here at Food Experience Unplugged. Are you enjoying the Food Experience Unplugged podcast and are ready to ramp it up a level? Then it's time to go premium. With a premium podcast membership, in addition to all the great podcast episodes you know and love, you'll receive additional bonus content and exclusive interviews from many of our podcast guests. You'll receive a live Q&A access each month where I'll address questions pertaining to holistic health and how you can start your journey. You'll also receive weekly shorter video clips with information on tips, tricks, and strategies to get started, to build consistent habits, and to take charge of your health. Go premium today. I'll see you there.